F.E.A.R is a horror first-person shooter, developed by Monolith Productions and published by Warner Bros. Games. Released 2005. As the first entry into what would become a critically acclaimed series, F.E.A.R provided a unique take on the first-person shooter genre with its hard-hitting weapons, intelligent AI, and Max Payne-styled slow-motion mechanic. Despite being a 15-year-old game, it still holds up today in many ways, especially in its gunplay. In F.E.A.R, weapons hit hard. This being the first community request of this series, it didn't take me long to see why so many people wanted me to cover it. Outrageous violence and gore are front and center. It's easy to forget that this is supposed to be a horror game when you're killing your way through squads of enemies in the primarily close-quarters environments. Heads and limbs can be removed with a well-placed blast from a shotgun, and with a shot to the gut they can be torn in half. Or if you're lucky, the enemy will literally vaporize into a giant cloud of blood. As completely stupid as this effect is, I must admit that it's at least hilariously entertaining. However, there doesn't appear to be any specific trigger for these effects. It seems entirely random whether gore is displayed or not. But later into the game, when more powerful weapons are found, the absurdity gets cranked up to 11. A multi-shot rocket launcher can send bursts of missiles into enemies, launching them airborne. This weapon is primarily useful for fighting the fun but weirdly out-of-place mech opponents. Then, of course, there's the Type 7 particle weapon. This gun can, in a single blast, turn most enemies into a skeleton. And how could I forget the rotating autocannon? A lot of these weapons feel more like they belong in a Quake-styled arena shooter, not a narrative-driven linear FPS. But F.E.A.R clearly doesn't care what you think. Fun definitely came first when the dev team was deciding on what weapons to include. But not every gun is a one-shot death machine. Other traditional weapons like the SMG, assault rifle, or dual-wielded pistols may not have the same impact and damage, but they certainly have their own place. Another feature that sets F.E.A.R apart from other games of the time is the enemy's reactions to your shots. Non-lethal shots don't just ricochet off unsatisfyingly. Enemies flinch hard when taking rounds. They'll be knocked back while attempting to keep their gun raised as effectively as possible. They can also fall over onto the ground, or even begin limping if shot in the legs, all of which negatively affects their precision, increasing your chance of survival. This means large groups of enemies can still be managed as long as you approach combat thoughtfully, combining not only the powerful weapons, but also your slow motion focus and combos of melee attacks that can get very creative. Kicking an enemy with a flying roundhouse kick might not exactly have anything to do with guns, but you're crazy if you think I'm not going to at least mention one of the best parts of the game. And part of what makes the gunfights of F.E.A.R so immersive is not only bullet impacts on enemies, but also the environment. Spraying bullets into walls and props around the map will leave behind massive particle effects and clouds of smoke, each of which vary based on the type of material being hit. Windows can be shattered and props can be destroyed. Framed paintings on walls have breakable glass, and computer monitors and printers can be popped open. And more impressively, F.E.A.R is one of the oldest games I've found to include parallax mapping on bullet impact craters, a system that takes a 2D texture and makes it appear 3D. F.E.A.R is just one of those games that feels good to play. The guns were designed to give a fantastic feeling of feedback to the player. Even though some weapons, namely automatic ones, seem a little light on damage, they never fail to provide satisfaction. Gunshot sound effects in F.E.A.R don't really jump out at you. They're honestly about as generic as it gets. While weapons like the shotgun and pistol at least sound fairly powerful, most automatic weapons like the assault rifle and SMG fall flat. They completely fail to convey any real feeling of power. It's pretty apparent seeing as the sound of shells hitting the ground is louder than the actual gunshots. And it's not just volume or mixing. The sound effects here themselves are kinda bad. And speaking of shells, while the sound does change based off of what type of surface they land on, every weapon shares the same shell sound effects, meaning that a 5.56 casing and a 12-gauge shell both have the same impact sound. But there are still some other weapons like the Type 7 that at least sound somewhat unique. However, when toggling slow motion, things start to get a bit worse. With automatic weapons, the gunshot sound effects don't even come close to actually lining up with your shots. And we don't even need slow motion to see the issue with the burst rifle. The gun fires 3 rounds, but you can clearly hear 5 shots per burst. So yes, most of the gunshot sound effects are underwhelming at best. However, that doesn't mean we should completely write off F.E.A.R's audio. While individual sound effects might not be impressive, the overall sound design and how these effects come together makes gunfights much more intense. Bullets ricochet off surfaces, smash through windows and props, and cut their way through enemy bodies. Gunfights in F.E.A.R. are dense, loud, and claustrophobic. Even with many poor quality sound effects, F.E.A.R. still manages to use them effectively to create convincing gunplay. Animation is probably where F.E.A.R. shows its age the most, but most of these animations are bad even by 2005 standards. Most reload animations aren't very animated at all. They kinda just drop the gun below the screen and bring it back up with full ammo. The assault rifle has a charging handle that isn't actually animated while reloading, but is while firing, and the shotgun reload takes the same amount of time regardless of how many shells you're inserting. And when you use the pump action, your hand isn't actually synced up with the pump. At least the slide on a pistol actually operates, despite being very strangely modeled. Not every game needs to focus on realism, but they should focus on some level of detail. All the weapon animations in F.E.A.R. just don't feel like they got the same treatment as the rest of the game. Muzzle flashes look somewhat decent, but for some weapons they remain at the point in which they were fired, separated from the gun. This is definitely better and more realistic than attaching the muzzle flash to the barrel, but the flashes stick around for way too long in slow motion, so it just adds to the already visually cluttered firefights. But this is only for certain weapons. The burst rifle and SMG have muzzle flashes that are locked to the barrel, which typically works better for gameplay. And I think I actually prefer the look of the shotgun's blast, which doesn't exactly have a muzzle flash, but instead a burst of sparks and a large smoke cloud that forms after every shot. I suppose it does further add to the screen clutter, but it's definitely more visually appealing than poorly done flashes. Each weapon can also be zoomed in. You can't aim down the sights, with the exception of the burst rifle, but the weapon is brought in tighter and precision is increased. This isn't a very notable feature by itself, but the problem is that if you zoom in while firing an automatic weapon, the gun will quickly snap to being aimed between shots. However, recoil does feel surprisingly good. It doesn't convey a huge sense of power, as weapons don't really kick back all that much, but all of the recoil animations are impressively seamless. This is something that I talked about in more detail during last episode's Insurgency Sandstorm, but basically instead of abruptly cutting between animations, they all smoothly transition into one another. You can run, jump, reload, and fire on enemies, and the weapon animations will always flow together without any noticeable cuts. So even though animation quality isn't the best, the animations still work somewhat well together. Accuracy in F.E.A.R. is all over the place. Not only does recoil tend to place your crosshair in a random spot after every shot, but bullet deviation is also kind of absurd. When using an automatic weapon, unless you're zoomed in and standing still, bullet deviation is extremely unforgiving. The same applies to the shotgun, which has incredibly high spread. But as annoying as it can be, this usually isn't a huge problem. Thankfully, most firefights in F.E.A.R. are very close range, so level design facilitates the system quite well. There are a few long-range fights that pop up from time to time, but it's never a huge issue. And being able to see the Matrix-style bullet trails in slow motion is also a very nice touch. However, as far as I can tell, all guns are hit scan. When firing outside of slow motion, there are tracer effects, but they're very slow and do not line up with the actual bullets, which impact long before the tracers do. However, despite some strange visual effects, bullets do prioritize a trajectory leaving the barrel. This is apparent when aiming slightly off target to the left of an enemy. But the weird thing about bullet trajectories is while they can be stopped by enemies, they cannot be stopped by the corners of walls and props. Tracer and bullet trail effects will end at the surface first along its trajectory, but the bullet itself will continue to pass through and always hit wherever the player is aiming. It's definitely an unorthodox strategy for handling accuracy, but I suppose it does help to ensure that players always hit their target and don't get caught up in the environment, which is always a welcome concept when it comes to close quarters first-person shooters. And if necessary, a leaning function can be utilized to peek around corners. I found this useless for most of my time with the game, but it would occasionally come in handy when low on health and out of slow motion focus. So overall, even though F.E.A.R. has a couple strange accuracy mechanics, everything works alright to provide a satisfying experience. As I mentioned in the introduction, this game was the first community request that I've done for this series, and I could not be happier that I finally played it. It still holds up quite well in many ways. While obviously it's not perfect, F.E.A.R. provides some incredibly enjoyable gunplay, with its powerful weapons and great sound design. And even though I didn't really talk about it, F.E.A.R. has some of the most impressive AI that I have ever experienced in a shooter, so it's at least worth mentioning. If you get the chance, you should definitely play this game. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.
Let's kick this off. Bravo 6. Moving on the rear garden. Take the front row.
secure.